Okay, dear students, today it's our lecture number 17th of Psycholinguistics. We're going to have a continuation of whatever we studied in the previous lecture. So we'll move on by going onwards towards attention 1, the selective attention. Now, we did go over this in the previous lecture, but once again I put it in so that it's very clear to you what we're going to be studying. Otherwise, then the context isn't so clear. So, attention 1, in selective attention, we possess an ability to tune into certain sources of input and exclude others. So sometimes we can tune ourselves in to hear something, or to and sometimes we can get in input from certain sources. Now, there is a classic cocktail party effect where a listener can attend to a single person at a large party despite many other often loud voices in the room. Now, that is how we can tune into hearing one single person. जब एक person बोल रहा हो, हमारी attention जो है वो solely उस person के ऊपर होती है. Now, yet somebody the other side of the room mentions the listener's name, she is immediately aware of it. So, at the same time, we are paying attention to that one particular person and listening to what they are saying with all the surrounding noise going around us. But even though we are still aware of all the voices and sounds going around us, and even though we're concentrating on that one single person, we're listening to that person or we are speaking to that person, we still, if our name has been mentioned or called, let's say at the other far corner of the room, we'll still be able to recognize and immediately attend to that also. We'll be aware that somebody has called our name. Now, that's the way how we possess the ability to tune into different situations and different listening sources. So it seems that we tune into a particular speaker, but that we continue to monitor speech elsewhere at a low level of attention. So it's just not all about just tuning in to one particular speaker, but also that we continue to monitor the speech. We are monitoring what else is going on in the room also. So not only that we're just paying attention to that one person, but we are also monitoring what's going on around us. So early work on attention accounted for this with the filter theory. So most of it worked with the filter theory. Now we are bombarded with information from the environment. For example, voices and sounds. So bombarded means that we are getting our ears are hearing voices and different sounds, and our brain is trying to comprehend all of that. But our perceptual system is set to filter out what is not relevant. So we have a perceptual system in our brain that works, that filters, sort of, it cleans out the stuff that we don't want, that is not related to us. So in a way, we are listening to that one person, we're focusing on that. Once again, we're filtering all those extra sounds out from the background. But if we're tuned into, pay attention to if we are called, or if somebody mentions us. So there was disagreement as to whether the filter was applied. Now, many of the researchers, they disagreed about that too. So at the outset, now limiting sensory evidence to the voice of the interlocutor. So maybe they're saying that they're limiting their sensory evidence just particularly to that one person that is speaking or we're listening to, while the evidence now was briefly stored in the mind, picking out the important voice from the others. So once again, we had the evidence that we were paying attention to one person, but then we heard a specific person call our name. So we picked that information, important information, out from the others, and we briefly stored it in mind, so we heard it. So after perception, now matching all voices to words, but focusing only on the interlocutors. So we were matching the voices, that who was calling me or who's saying my name, but also we are focusing on that one person. So attention 2, now attentional capacity. What's our capacity to pay attention to? Now attention involves mental effort. You know that too. If you want to pay attention to something, you have to involve mental effort in it, with some tasks requiring more than others. So some tasks would require more effort on your part than others. However, now the capacity of our working memory, our WM, is regarded as limited. So our ability to carry out two tasks simultaneously thus depends upon how much of that capacity each task demands. So, however, the capacity of the working memory, we would say that it's still limited. We don't have a huge amount of capacity in our working memory to store stuff continuously. But our ability to carry out two tasks, like side by side at the same time, depends on how each task would, how much time or how much attention each task demands from us. So that's how we can see that if we can carry out those two tasks at the same time or not. Now, an influential model, Kahneman in 1973, represents attention as using up memory capacity, but makes allowance for other contributory factors. So variations, sometimes that model would say that they're using up the memory capacity, but it's also giving allowance for other contributory factors, like, for example, number one would be variations in the working memory capacity of each individual. So each individual would have a different capacity of working memory to store in his working memory. Variations in the affective state of the individual, tired or depressed. So if a person is tired or depressed, then they can't, their working memory won't work so well. They can't store things as easily as a person who's calm or happy or satisfied. So the third variation would be in the motivation of the individual, how motivated that person is to store the memory or store the particular thing related to whatever topic he's thinking about. So visual attention in particular is sometimes likened to a spotlight which lights up a chosen portion of the visual field. So sometimes visual attention in particular would be very similar to when you're putting something into a spotlight. And it lights up a chosen portion of the visual field, so just that particular spot is highlighted. When you put a spotlight on something, then that thing would be emphasized. So same thing, like a spotlight, it can be highly focused or diffuse also. So it can either highly focus it or diffuse what you are seeing around it. So where a task makes heavy demands, attention is concentrated very closely on a target. So even though when tasks make heavy demands, then still your attention is, you're concentrating your attention on a target very closely. ज़्यादा ध्यान देते हैं आप उस किसी एक चीज़ के ऊपर. You'll fix a target and then you'll focus your attention more on that. Now, where a task demands fewer attentional resources, there seems to be a peripheral area to which partial attention is given. So, even though हम किसी एक चीज़ पे बहुत ज़्यादा फोकस कर रहे हो, still हमारे माइंड का एक हिस्सा ऐसा होता है जो partial चीज़ें भी intake उसकी जो है ना हो रही होती है, वहाँ से हमें वो partial चीज़ें भी पता लग रहा होता है. अब जैसे for example, now I'm paying attention towards you, but I will know what's going on around in my surroundings. Even though I would be teaching you at this moment, giving you a lecture at this moment, but still I would be aware of the sounds going around outside the classroom. So thus adjacent letters may influence a reader's ability to perform a letter identification task. So sometimes maybe adjacent letters, that if there are more letters in it, that would influence a reader's ability to perform in a letter identification task. It would either perform in a negative way or in a positive way also. So, as well as influencing models of first language reading and listening, the notion of attention plays a part in theories of second language acquisition. So, as well as influencing the models of a first language, of reading and listening in the first language, then it still we would say that it plays an important part in the theories when we are trying to acquire a second language, or when we are trying to learn a second language. So second language acquisition would play a part in that. Now there, an important issue is, do we have to notice, give attentional focus to the form of a word or our grammatical structure in order to acquire it? So at this point what we want to see is that do we have to notice it, do we have to give attention to it, to the form of a word or of the grammatical structure of a sentence or a word for us to acquire that or learn it? Is it a must that we have to pay attention to the form of the word? So, to what extent is our attention directed towards meaning in an L2 communicative situation and away from the form of words that a native speaker is using? So, how can we learn those techniques of acquiring a second language and the communicative situation in a second language when we're using it with the native speaker? So, for example, now, English is my native language, Urdu is your native language. So now when you are going to be learning English, you are going to be interacting with me. So that communicative situation, now how would you know what form of words you want to use when you're speaking to me? So for me, Urdu is a second language. English would be my native language. So in that situation, then I would be a native speaker of English and you would be a native speaker of Urdu. So when I want to communicate with you in Urdu, once again, I need to think of the words that I need to use. I need to think of the form of the words that I'm going to use to communicate to you. Reason? So that I can communicate in a way that you can understand me. Same way, in English, you're going to have to learn how to communicate with a native speaker or with me in the same situation. But same time, when you're doing that, will you worry about the grammatical rules? Sometimes in speech, I wouldn't really care so much if I did. Yes, people would laugh if I ruined the grammatical structure of a sentence in Urdu. But once again, when I am randomly trying to put together the words, so for me it's a new language, and when I was learning it, I had extreme difficulty structuring it grammatically. So the same thing you might have also. I can understand that it's very difficult for you also to understand English in that way, that it would be grammatically right. So now, to what extent do we think our attention is directed towards meaning? How much do you think that we are paying attention towards meaning in learning a second language? So, attrition. Now, attrition means the decline of competence in a language over time. So, attrition would be that we are losing the competence or the ability or the high qualities of language over a period of time. Now, usually as the result of contact with another language. So sometimes when we are using a different language, then we sort of start forgetting the language that we knew before. Now, that happened with me when I was learning different languages in my bachelor's and master's. Once again, I was very fluent at that time in Russian language. But because English was my native language, now, when I was living there, I started forgetting English, and I was speaking more in Russian while I was studying it. But as soon as I completed my studies and I came back to Pakistan, now I don't have Russian friends. So what I'm doing is I'm constantly speaking either in Urdu or in English. Now, when I'm using these two languages, my ability or my competence in Russian language has declined. Why? It's not that I've forgotten about it. Like if I put stress on my memory, I might recall a lot of the language. But sometimes I forget things. I forget how to grammatically structure a sentence in Russian. Or I forget to what a particular word, I want to say something and I can't think of that exact word. So this happens when we are in contact with another language. So because I'm here, I've started speaking, there I was like speaking in Russian and English. Here I'm speaking in Urdu and English. And then when I try to speak in Russian, I find it difficult. So same thing you would find it also when you're trying to learn a new language, you would have the same difficulty. Now, attrition is distinguished from language loss as a result of aging also. So it's not all about just a contact with another language, but you can also distinguish it with the loss of language as a result of getting older. So primary language attrition now particularly affects immigrant populations and arises as the result of extended exposure to a second language and of circumstances in which the first language is little used. So primary language attrition would particularly mean that it affects immigrant populations, and it would result as extended exposure also to a second language when we're learning a second language. So immigrant population, it would affect them, like for example, when they come to, many immigrants come to the US, then they're exposed to English more than they are exposed to their native language. And at that time then they are, because of being exposed to that language, so English would be their second language, in which their first language is used very little. So they get more exposure towards English and they start learning more about it. And in a way they sort of, their own native language goes in the back of their memory. So integrative motivation may also be a strong factor, especially in the case of children. So also integrative motivation, that the motivation of children learning, so why they are learning a language, that also is a strong factor in it. So how children would learn a language and how would they learn a second language. So attrition may be indicated by a speaker's inability to make grammaticality judgments in the native language, but is often evidence in performance. So attrition, we could indicate that speaker's inability using the grammatical rules or judging somebody grammatically in the native language, that would make a huge difference, but also how they perform in the production of language. So in an inability to retrieve vocabulary, in a loss of native-like pronunciation, in the use of non-standard syntax, or in a general lack of fluency. So how would it affect it? Like I said, sometimes when I'm trying to recall words in Russian, I can't think of the vocabulary to use. Sometimes I can maybe not pronounce the words properly, so the pronunciation is affected. Because I'm so used to using English and Urdu now, I forget about that language. So maybe some non-standard syntax or structure, or a lack in fluency. I'm not so fast in speaking. So I do have difficulty sometimes speaking in Urdu also, because that's my second language also. So having fluency, now I'm fluent in English. Same way you will be fluent in Urdu. But if you keep practicing, you can become fluent in English also. So it's attrition tends to affect production to a great degree than reception. So it's more affecting production than reception of it, and may also vary between writing and speaking. So sometimes even in writing or speaking the language, it depends, it would go back and forth. Now, some bilinguals show evidence of attrition as a result of employing one of their languages to a greater degree than the other. Like I said, me being a bilingual, now if I'm paying more attention to one particular language, then I'm going to forget the other. So if I'm putting more attention towards English and Urdu, so that is the reason why I'm forgetting about how to speak Russian. Now, but at that time when I had learned it, I was very fluent in it. So as a grammatical competence in one language declines, the grammar of the other may become the benchmark for both. So even though if my grammatical competence would get less in Russian, I would use English or the English grammatical rules as a benchmark for both, which won't work. So, however, an alternative phenomenon with some bilinguals is code switching. So sometimes they would do code switching, where two languages become reserved for specific domains. Now, one for the home and one for school. Now, that's what happens with you, students, because at home, most of you would be speaking in Urdu or Punjabi, but at school or university or in your colleges, you are forced to speak in English, because all your courses are in English. So mostly your professors or your teachers also interact with you in English. So in a way, you are code switching between what you are speaking at home with your family and comfortable with, and one that you're speaking with your teachers or your fellow students. Second language attrition commonly occurs when a speaker has not had occasion to use a foreign language for some time. Now, second language attrition, that means the same thing that I am facing, that I haven't been able to speak Russian for so long that I am having difficulty. So I haven't spoken that's a foreign language for me. So it would occur when a speaker had not occasion. I don't have any occasion or anybody to speak Russian to, so then I would fall under the second language attrition. That means that I would forget the language. Now, it is difficult to research because of the difficulty of establishing the level of competence in L2 prior to the attrition. Why people have difficulty researching this or learning about it is because they think that if somebody doesn't know how well you are in the second language, then they won't know how worse you've gotten, you see. But it would appear that lexis is more readily subject to attrition than syntax. So your vocabulary, loss of vocabulary would be more readily the subject of loss than the structure. It's easy to make the structure, but if you lose the vocabulary, then it's difficult to form sentences. So some commentators argue that language is represented differently in the minds of native and non-native speakers. So if this is the case, then L2 attrition may be different in kind from primary language attrition. So some commentators would say that its language would be presented differently. Now, a native speaker would take language in a different way than what a non-native speaker would gather. So a native can understand the language better. The way his mind processes the language would be very different from a non-native speaker. Now, a non-native speaker he's learned the grammatical rules, he's learned the vocabulary, but the way he would process the language would be very different from the person who is a native speaker. Now, if this is the case, then L2 attrition may be different in some kind of primary language attrition. So if that would be the thing that, yes, that both of them, the mind is processing the language in a different way, then the way you learn a second language might have a different kind of form than from what we would say in when you're losing your native language or you're forgetting about it. So, auditory perception. Now you can see speech perception related to auditory perception. Now, augmented transition network, ATN. Augmented transition network. This is a type of computer program, now designed by researchers in artificial intelligence, which attempts to represent the way in which an utterance is processed syntactically by a listener to or a reader. So, researchers have designed a computer program to test or experiment different language settings. So in this, that it's all based on artificial intelligence, like a computer also, okay? So, and it would represent in how different words are uttered and how it affects them syntactically, like with structure, by a listener or a reader. Now an ATN consists of a series of points at which accumulated evidence can lead to a change of state and thus a new direction for the processing. So it would consist of series of points now that we accumulate for the evidence, which can lead to or point towards the change of state and thus a new direction for the processing of a language. Now the point occurs after each complete phrase and sentence as well as after each word. Now thus enabling syntactic structures to be built. So the points would occur after each complete phrase or after each word or after each sentence for enabling us to build syntactic structures of the language. Now the processing occurs top down. At the highest level, a network seeks evidence of a complete sentence in a pattern of a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. Now control then passes to the noun phrase level, where a parallel network seeks evidence of a determiner followed possibly by an adjective and then followed by a noun. So once the noun has been located, the outcome is sent to the sentence level and a verb phrase is sought. So the highest level of network seeks the evidence for a complete sentence would be in the pattern of the noun phrase followed by the verb phrase. Then the control that passes to the noun phrase level, where a parallel network seeks evidence of a determiner followed possibly by an adjective and then followed by a noun. So once the noun has been located, once we know what the noun is, the outcome is sent to the sentence level and a verb phrase is sought. So once we've distinguished what noun it is, then we will need to see what verb would suit it. So while computer networks of this kind enable programs to process pieces of text, they are heavily dependent upon conventional sentence structures. And their top-down nature leads to many incorrect predictions and much backtracking. So next we would move on to autism. Autism. Now that is a condition characterized by a withdrawal from linguistic interaction with others. How? When we stop having linguistic interaction with people, then that condition would characterized by a withdrawal. So an autism would be that the sufferer is often mute or uses language in a non-communicative way. So either the person cannot speak, that's why there isn't any interaction with others, or maybe that person doesn't like to speak a lot. So one would be a genetic fact, a disease that, or let's say a loss of speech, जो लोग बोल नहीं सकते, गूंगे होते हैं, या फिर वो लोग जो चूज नहीं करते ज़्यादा बात करना, इन लोगों से इंटरैक्ट करना. Now, the symptoms of autism appear between the ages of 1 and 3 and are sometimes misdiagnosed as deafness. So sometimes autism में जो है वो 1 साल के बच्चे से लेके 3 साल के बच्चे तक के एज में होता है, और sometimes क्योंकि बच्चा बोल नहीं रहा होता या बोलना चाह नहीं रहा होता, ठीक है, उसको हम मिसडायग्नोज कर देते हैं कि ये बहरा, इसको आवाज़ नहीं आ रही. अगर इसको आवाज़ नहीं आ रही, दैट मीन्स के वो बात नहीं कर रहा. दैट्स व्हाई ही इज नॉट रिप्लाइंग. सो they include delayed cognitive and linguistic development and a reduced ability to react to people, events and objects. So इसमें क्या होता है कि इसमें cognitive ability delay हो जाती है, learning ability, और linguistic development slow हो जाती है, ठीक है. When linguistic development is slow, at that time it reduces the ability for them to react to people. किसी ने कोई बात की है तो उस चीज़ को react करना, उसको understand करके to react to that person or an event or an object. Those are the symptoms that show. So Autistic children tend to have exceptionally low IQs, but they may excel in one or two isolated skills such as painting or music. So, जो बच्चे autism से they are affected by it or they're suffering by autism, they would have a very low IQ. Intelligence level उनका बहुत low होगा. But किसी एक आध चीज़ में, किसी एक आध skill में maybe उनका बहुत high हो. Like for example painting में या music में किसी एक चीज़ में उनका intelligence level high होगा. The syndrome is much more common in males than in females and appears to be caused by a physical dysfunction of the brain. So ये syndrome ज़्यादातर male children में ज़्यादा है female children के निस्बत. Females में कम होता है, males में ज़्यादा होता है. और ये एक physical dysfunction जो है आपके brain में उसकी वजह से होता है. Like it is a brain disease. Some physical dysfunction of the brain causes it, the males to be affected more than the females. Now, it was once suggested that the child mutism represents a deliberate withholding of language, or possibly a dislike of human speech, but it may be part of a general difficulty with all forms of communication. So, एक time ऐसा है कि लोगों ने suggest किया, the researchers suggested that maybe child's mutism, मतलब कि वो बोल नहीं रहा बच्चा, ठीक है, represents deliberate withholding of language, ठीक है, जानबूझ के बच्चा वो बोलना नहीं चाह रहा, या he doesn't like human speech. Now, it may be part of both, or it could be one, but it's a general part of a general difficulty to communicate with other people. So some children remain mute until the age of 5 and beyond. So कुछ बच्चे ये 5 साल की age तक mute रहते हैं, and they even stay beyond that also. With others, the mutism gives way to a delayed acquisition of speech. So दूसरों के साथ क्या होता है कि they go through this phase and then they gradually get out of it and they start acquiring speech. Now here pronunciation of phonemes will generally be unimpaired, though rhythm and intonation may be flat and monotonous. So maybe phonemes जो है वो damage नहीं होते, pronunciations of phonemes is not damaged, but the rhythm in which they say the word or the intonations, यानी आपका rise and fall of voice जो है, या आप किसी चीज़ पे emphasis देने के लिए जोर देते हैं, वो चीज़ में भी flat and monotonous हो जाएगी, यानी एक ही उसमें बोल देंगे without any ups and downs or fluctuation in your pronunciations. So other aspects of language, now including the processing of meaning, may deviate from normal patterns. So sometimes maybe an aspect of language, including the processing of meaning, may deviate from normal patterns, would be different, perhaps partly because of an inability to make links between world knowledge and linguistic experience. So sometimes other aspects would matter, ठीक है, it would include the processing of meaning also, meaning को कैसे process कर रहे हैं from normal patterns, or perhaps partly because of an inability to make links, यानी एक ability ही नहीं है किसी में दो चीज़ों को, world knowledge को linguistic experience को link करने का, to make a link or a connection between the world knowledge and the linguistic experience. So it can be caused by both of them. An important symptom of autism is echolalia. Now, where the child meaninglessly repeats what has been said to it. Echolalia is another way, जब बच्चा उसको मतलब नहीं समझ आ रहा बात का, but he keeps on repeating what has been said to him. It was once believed that echolalia indicates a rejection of interaction. So that means कि एक time आया था कि researchers said कि वो interaction से rejection है, बच्चा interact नहीं करना चाह रहा, that's why he does that. Now it is sometimes interpreted as evidence that the autistic child does not succeed in grasping the true function of language. So sometimes अब ये चीज़ भी समझ आ रही है और evidence के तौर पे है कि जो child autistic है, ठीक है, he will not, he is not succeeding in grasping the true function, उसको function ही नहीं समझ आ रहा language का. That's why he's having difficulty, and he keeps on repeating similar things like that. Now, delayed echolalia, where the child repeats an earlier string of words out of context, appears sometimes to have a communicative intent. So you can say that he has a communicative intent, even though when he's trying to communicate by repeating words to you. But you're not, it still comes under the form of delayed echolalia. Now, other symptoms are an unwillingness to meet the gaze of a speaker and difficulties with the use of pronouns. So another symptom would be that the child will refuse to look at you when speaking, and he would have difficulty using pronouns. Now, one interpretation is that autistic children find it hard to develop an awareness of the separate viewpoint of others, a theory of mind. So one interpretation would be that it's the autistic child would find it difficult to or hard to develop different points of views, a separate awareness of separate point of views of others, how the mind or the theory of the mind. So even where sufferers from autism go on to achieve a relatively normal use of language, they may experience problems with pragmatics. So even though later on they grow up to learn the language properly and use it normally, at some point still it shows that they would still have difficulty in pragmatics. So automaticity, the ease or efficiency with which knowledge can be retrieved or manipulated. Automaticity is how our brain functions, how we retrieve material from our brain and produce the language, either in trying to translate it. When we're listening to somebody, we're trying to understand what the other person is saying, so automatically we would refer to our memory and see. And once again, when we want to produce language. So the ease or efficiency in which knowledge can be retrieved or manipulated, how we can retrieve it, how fast we can retrieve it. Distinction can be made between controlled and automatic processes. So in this, what we would say is that we can make a distinction between the controlled process or the automatic process of retrieving language. So when a task is unfamiliar, it demands conscious attention or control, and sometimes has to be performed step by step. Now, gradually, as we become more skilled at the task, the process becomes automatized, demanding less and less mental effort. So gradually, when we are getting skilled at a certain language or producing a language or trying to comprehend a language, the process would become sort of automatic. So, and we would put less effort, we would use less mental effort to try to comprehend a language or to produce it. So the advantage in developing automatic process is that they do not impose demands upon working memory capacity. So there is no demand on the working memory capacity. It doesn't say that you have to store this much in your working memory or you have to store certain amount, and thus enable us to give attention to other tasks. So then because of that, then it also gives us time or the ability to give attention to the other tasks. Now, thus adults open doors with a high degree of automaticity because they have performed the operation many times. So for adults, it's maybe easier because we have done it so many times over and over again that it's more easier for us to automatically refer to something. Now, this permits them to perform more attention-demanding tasks at the same time, such as holding a conversation. So, like for us, trying to pay attention to a conversation while doing something else as an adult would be much easier than a child. So our attention span we would have to put less mental effort on it, especially when we are having a conversation. Now we can have a conversation while we are working, let's say on a computer also. You do that sometimes too. You're working, but some people, like if they're working on the computer, they cannot understand what you're talking about. So their lack of holding a conversation would be their lack of attention. And they have to put more effort, more mental effort, trying to concentrate on what the person is saying. But some people, they once if you have an ability or you excel in that skill, then for adults it's not that difficult to perform two things at the same time. Now, automatic processes are slow to set up, but once set up are difficult to modify or suspend because they are not immediately under our voluntary control. So automatic processes are slow to set up, but once we make them, we set them up, then it's difficult to modify or suspend them because they're not immediately under our voluntary control, and it just suddenly happens. Like we can't voluntarily control what our automatic process is doing. So a good example is Stroop effect. Now, when a literate English speaker is presented with the word red written in green and asked to name the color of the ink, they find the task very difficult. Okay, so now imagine that. Imagine the word red written in green ink, and you're asked to tell you what ink it's written in. They would find that task very difficult. The reason is that the response of a reader to the visual stimulus red is so highly automatized, giving immediate access to the notion of redness or the color of redness, that it is hard to suppress it and to focus instead on the color of the script. So because we are complete photo, our automatic focus would be on the color red. When we read red, we would immediately imagine the red color. So then coming and focusing back on saying that the script is written, that same word is written in green ink, would be a little time consuming. So because automatic processing is rapid and does not demand attentional resources, it is not usually available to report. So sometimes you can't report from it, it just happens automatically, and it's you don't do it on an intentional base. So an automatic process is often a set of sub-processes which have become composed, combined into a larger sequence. So something that has been, the sub-processes, it's divided into that and composed and combined into a larger sequence. Now once this sequence has been established, we are no longer consciously aware of the subsequences and unable to report on them. So once we have established the sequence, we won't be consciously aware of the subsequences, we won't be consciously aware of what else, and it would be difficult for us to report on them and say that such and such has happened. So the concept of automaticity is especially important in theories of reading. पढ़ने में सबसे ज़्यादा important है इसकी theory. So a skilled reader is seen as one who is capable of decoding a text, recognizing words on a page automatically. So skilled reader वो होगा जो पेज के ऊपर फौरन automatically उसका words को पहचान ले on any page, and he can decode it or understand what's written in the text. As this decoding operation makes few or no demands on working memory, there is ample memory capacity available for constructing a mental representation of the text and for bringing world knowledge to bear on what is read. So sometimes when we are reading books, I even do that too, that when we are reading books, I can picture what's going on, like a movie going in my mind. So while I'm reading, let's say, a novel, I can picture the scene that is going on, I can picture the characters. I make a mental picture of the characters in my mind, and then according to that, then I replay the scenes like a movie in my head. So sometimes it happens naturally, I've just gotten so used to doing it. So even you can try doing it. Students, it would be a good experiment. So because automatically we are decoding and it's not putting demand on our working memory. So that's why our working memory is available to make mental representations of the text, and for bringing the world knowledge to bear, like we can bring in other thoughts to decode a certain thing that we're reading. Now, the degree of automaticity with which we perform a language task may vary according to the demands of the task. So sometimes the degree of it, to what length or what degree we are performing a language task, it could vary according to the demands of the task. Now, a conversation in a bar is likely to be highly automatic, while writing a business letter demands a degree of control. So a conversation in a bar, which would be a common place where friends are gathering, it would be very automatic and just natural. You don't have to think of what you're doing, what you're saying. You don't have to pre-plan. But if you want to write a business letter, then you have to pre-plan the contents of it in your mind. And you need to have a certain degree of control in your writing format, in the words you're going to use, in the selection of words. So, autonomous now. And that was how you automatically turn towards your mind, how it represents it. Now, autonomous means that descriptive of a model of language use in which each level of processing is independent of the others. So autonomous would be something where each level of processing is independent, it doesn't have any link with the others. So for example, an autonomous model of listening assumes that the recognition of speech sounds is unaffected by knowledge of the possible words which those sounds might form. So, for example, a model of listening assumes that when you are recognizing the speech sounds, then you are unaffected by the knowledge of the possible words and which you would, those sounds might form or they would give or you would hear. So we hear distinctly that the noun word sequence, Dable, begins with D. And this perception is not influenced. So while we are processing for phonemes by the resemblance to the actual word table, though it may be at a later stage. So when we hear distinctly that the noun word sequence Dable begins with D, and this perception is not influenced while we are processing for phonemes by the resemblance to the actual word table. Now, what we are thinking is we are saying the actual word we know is table, but because we see the word Dable, we can immediately say that yes, the word begins with a D instead of a T. So, though it might be at a later stage, but we still will recognize it. So, in babbling then, now, when we move on and see in babbling, a pre-linguistic stage when infants produce sounds which resemble adult consonant vowels, the CV syllables, the consonant vowel syllables. This is at that point when the child starts producing the sounds. Now, infants begin to babble at about 6 to 10 months of age, and the stage lasts for up to 9 months. So by the time of from to 9 months, they are learning to babble about different words they're saying. They're learning how to pronounce the sounds. Now, 2 types of babbling are observed. Reduplicated babble, that they hear somebody and they would imitate with the same consonant vowel sequence, repeated ba, 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 and variegated babble. Now, variegated babble with different consonant vowel sequences combined bamido. So, we are ba, me, do. That is 3 different consonant vowel sequence. Now, both sometimes adopt an intonation pattern which resembles adult speech. So, when they are babbling, they are still sort of resembling adult speech at that time. Now, there are conflicting views as to whether babbling contributes to phonological development. So there is a conflicting view as to whether it does contribute to it or it doesn't help in developing it. Now, a discontinuity hypothesis claims that there is no link. So a discontinuity in a hypothesis would claim that there isn't any link between babbling to phonological development. So exponents point out that some infants undergo a silent period between babbling and the emergence of speech, and that regardless of target language TL, there seems to be a set order in which phonological features are acquired. So regardless of the target language, still there seems to be a set in order in which phonological features are acquired by a child or by an infant. So a continuity hypothesis maintains that babbling is a precursor to speech, enabling the infant to practice a range of potentially useful sounds, which increasingly resembles those of the target language. Now, the consonant vowel syllables produced during later babbling are said to recur in the infant's first words, and there is said to be a strong correlation between the frequency of sounds in babbling and their frequency in the target language. That said, it should be noted that the omnipresent English sound emerges late, as do fricatives in general. So now, when we go on ahead and see the basic level, in the basic level, a level in a system of hyphonymy which is neither too specific nor too general. Now, it is often shown as intermediate between the two other terms. So it's maybe a center point or a middle point between the two things. For example, now dog is a basic level term which is a hyponym of animal and a superordinate of poodle. So dog would be a basic level term. For all of the dogs we would say that. And it's a hyponym of an animal, but maybe we were talking about a specific breed of dog. So in that would be a superordinate of a poodle dog. So the importance of basic level terms seems to lie in the fact that they have clearly identifiable attributes in terms of shape and behavior. Now, this distinguishes them from higher and lower categories. So maybe it can distinguish them from different views and different shapes and behaviors also, and something that is highly thought of or in lower categories. So a large percentage of a child's early words are basic level terms. So what they're learning in the start, in their early words, is just the basic terms. This suggests that both the adult carrier and the infant find such terms easier to categorize. So it does suggest that both the adult carrier, the person who is transferring the language to the child, and the infant, they find such terms easier to categorize into. So the structure of the lexicon also seems, the vocabulary also seems to support the acquisition process, the word forms attached to basic level categories. And they are often simpler than those at other levels. So sometimes they're more easier to understand or categorize. Further on, if we go on and study about behaviorism. Now, in psycholinguistics, behaviorism has a big role. A movement in psychology important in the first half of the 20th century. So it was based upon a view prevalent from the 1920s to the 1950s. The behaviorism was, at that time, researchers were studying it in the first half of the 20th century. That means like from 1920s to 1950s. So as you know, that psycholinguistics was developed much later in 1960s and given a separate field, was recognized as a separate field. So, but by in the 1920s to the 1950s, that we can only speculate about the operations of the human mind, and that psycholinguists should therefore restrict themselves to studying external manifestations of human behavior. So, in behaviorism at that time, based upon that view, they said that the operation of a human mind, how a mind operates, how it produces language, how it stores language. So the psycholinguists should therefore restrict themselves to the studying just about the external manifestations of a human behavior. Some of the proponents of behaviorism denied the existence of consciousness. So it was suggested that thought was dependent upon language and was a sub-vocal form of speech. So maybe you could not produce language at that time. They thought that you can't produce language without thought, or thought is dependent on the production of language. You can only think when you're trying to produce language. So behaviorism, like we did study previously also, behaviorism is principally a theory of learning based upon the relationship between an external stimulus and the individual's response to it through acquired behavior. So behaviorism is what? It's basically a theory that studies about the external stimulus and the relationship between one person as an individual, how they would respond according to their behavior. Now, one type of learning is classical conditioning, where an established response becomes attached to a new stimulus. So one type of learning would be classical conditioning, and this we are talking about how an established response could become attached to something new, a new stimulus. Now, for example, Pavlov trained dogs to associate food with the ringing of a bell, and they finally began to salivate when they heard the bell alone. So what Pavlov did is he made an experiment on dogs, and what he did was he would ring a certain bell at the time when their feeding time was. So later on, whenever those dogs heard the bell, they would start salivating in anticipation that they are going to receive food. So another is operant conditioning. That would be how they associated food with in that. Another is operant conditioning, where a response becomes established because it is rewarded or reinforced. So sometimes we can say, like in a dog, if we say that, okay, go fetch a ball, we throw a ball and we make our pet, our dog, go and fetch it, then when he comes back, we would reward him with a piece of food or some sort of treat. Now, next time when we are going to throw the ball, the dog is going to come back in that same anticipation that he's going to be rewarded. So that would be operant conditioning, when it's known that you're going to get a reward or you're going to get reinforced for it. Now, asserting that language is simply verbal behavior, Skinner in 1957 put forward an account of first language acquisition based upon operant conditioning. His view was that a child acquires language through imitating adult utterances. Now, parents provide models of language. They also provide reinforcement through showing approval, through carrying out the child's wishes, or through recognizing, responding to, and echoing the child's utterances. So asserting that language is simply a verbal behavior, Skinner, who was a researcher in 1957, he said that the first account of a first language acquisition, your native language, would be based upon operant conditioning, if you are getting a reward for it. Now, in his view, a child would acquire language through imitating adult utterances, by imitating what the adults are saying. Now, parents provide a model of language. So whatever our parents, what we learn is, according to him, is from how our parents would teach us. Now, they also provide reinforcement through showing approval by saying that yes, you did well, through carrying out the child's wishes or recognizing them, by saying yes, okay, the child says I want to have such and such, and the parent would agree to that. Responding to and echoing the child's utterances also. Now utterances which approximate to adult language are rewarded, others are not. So sometimes those utterances a child would be rewarded which has a similarity to the adult language, and the others won't be rewarded. So the child would know that, okay, if I repeat such and such thing, I would receive a reward. So that would enhance imitation and learning of language also. Now, grammar is said to develop in the form of sentence frames into which words or phrases can be inserted. So grammar is like a sort of a frame in which we can insert phrases or words to make complete sentences, properly grammatically structured. Now, a process of chaining accounts for the way in which words are organized in sequence, with the first word in the sentence providing a stimulus for the second. Now, the second for the third, and so on. So a process, it's like a chain process. You go from one to another to another to another, linking all of those sequences. Now, you can organize words into sequence. Now you can have the first word in a sentence providing a stimulus for the second one, and then the second word providing it for the third for the fourth, and the fourth for the fifth. Now this account considerably stretches what was originally understood by the term stimulus and reinforcement. So this account, maybe you can stretch it to that point that you can say that originally understood by the terms what stimulus means and what reinforcement means, when you link things through a chain. Now, Skinner attempted to categorize child language in terms of the behavioral functions involved. So what did Skinner do? He was trying to categorize how a child learns the language according to his behavioral functions, or how he would behave. Now he identified echoic utterances, imitations, 1/4 imitation, demands, where the child expresses a wish for something. So they keep on repeating it. They give those utterances again and again and again, because when they want something like buy me a candy, they'll keep on repeating that. That would be echoic utterances. Facts where the child responds to non-verbal cues by, for example, naming something. And socially driven intraverbal responses which bear no syntactic relationship to the verbal stimulus that gave rise to them. So, Skinner's account of language acquisition received a scathing review from the young Noam Chomsky, who asserted that adult speech is improvised and therefore does not provide a good or adequate model for imitation. So Skinner's account of how language is acquired received a scathing review. That means Noam Chomsky was not pleased by Skinner's account of language acquisition. And Noam Chomsky, he asserted that adult speech is improvised, so therefore it does not provide a good, adequate model for imitation for a child. So nor can imitation explain why infants produce incorrect utterances such as I goed. So once again, older person or an adult would never say I goed. They'll always say I went. Yeah, I go. But children sometimes use those incorrect utterances like I goed through when speaking, but that isn't due to imitation. So Chomsky pointed out that parents reinforce and correct very few of their child's utterances. Now this is very, very true, because if you see in our families also, if you have little brother and sisters or cousins or nieces and nephews, you can see that when they are saying, uttering different words, when they're mispronouncing a word, or that a parent will very seldom correct the child that no, don't say this, say that. Very less. Most of the time we will just ignore what the child is saying. So in that way, the child keeps on doing the same thing again. He won't know the difference between right and wrong. Now, most importantly, he drew attention to the generative nature of language. So what Noam Chomsky said, what he did was he drew attention to the generative nature of language. Now, suggesting that a theory of language acquisition must account for the way in which the infant acquires the capacity to produce an infinite number of grammatical utterances, most of which it cannot have heard before. So suggesting that a theory of language acquisition must account for the way how a child would acquire a language, or the capacity, in which capacity it can produce the language, to an infinite number of grammatical utterances, and most of which it cannot have heard before. Something that he doesn't know about beforehand. So this was how Skinner viewed it, and how Noam Chomsky had a complete different view from Skinner. So there are so many things that researchers are contradicting each other while studying a particular language. So these are the things that by time that you see. That's why it's very important to learn the history of a certain field also, because many researchers, they keep on researching, they will come to a conclusion, and then another one would come up and contradict their theory and give another theory. So the thing is that we cannot discount Skinner's view, and we cannot discount Noam Chomsky's. So both of them are of equal value, and we can experiment with both of those. Now, both views have their own pros and cons. So nowadays, when you are trying to, if you're going to further research on psycholinguistics, then these references are going to help you in doing that and understanding the language. So today, I think, students, that's enough for today. We will continue the same lecture, again psycholinguistics, in the next one, in lecture number 18. And further, I'll go on explaining how both of these researchers went on and what their theories were about acquisition of language. So thank you, take care.